Let's go ahead and get started. We're continuing in our series through the Psalms, and we're in Psalm 52. Psalm 52, and I've titled this one, Doeg's Folly. Doeg's Folly. Let's go ahead and read that. Psalm 52. To the chief musician, Maskil, a psalm of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said unto him, David is come to the house of Ahimelech. Why boasteth thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Thy tongue deviseth mischiefs, like a sharp razor, working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Selah. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place, and root thee out of the land of the living. Selah. The righteous also shall see and fear, and shall laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise thee forever, because thou hast done it. And I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. Okay. So, how many of you are familiar with the story of Doeg's Folly? It's not one that stuck. You don't count. This Psalm of David was written after Doeg the Edomite told Saul about Ahimelech's aid and prayers for David. This is obviously during the time period in which Saul was king. David, at this point, is beloved by the people. He has been loyal to Saul. He's never tried to undermine Saul at any point, even though David himself had been anointed to be king, to be the next king. He wasn't going to, by any means available to him, try to make that exchange go faster. But Saul was jealous of David, and Saul was nuts. And it's in the Hebrew somewhere. And so he was after David, thinking that David was a threat to his throne and certainly to his popularity and to his power. And so he was trying to find David and kill him. All the while, David maintained his loyalty to the king. But this psalm is written after Doeg tells Saul about how Ahimelech had aided David and prayed for him. And the result of Doeg's folly was that Ahimelech's entire family was murdered, including 85 priests of the Lord. And David's prayer here in this psalm shows how he dealt with this crisis in which he was a central figure. And since it's a short psalm, as it was noted earlier tonight, I'm going to read an entire passage from 1 Samuel chapter 22. And that's the story of Doeg's folly. So let's just, I'll read that. It's 1 Samuel 22, and beginning in verse 6 is where we'll pick up in the story. And when Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. Then Saul said unto his servants that stood about him, Hear now, ye Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? And that all of you have conspired against me, and there's none that showeth me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse, and there is none of you that is sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son hath stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. And so here we have Saul. He's troubled in his mind. He's furious at his inability to squash this self-righteous little upstart shepherd boy, right? And so he accuses his men and his son Jonathan of conspiring against him and colluding with David. And he has evidently heard that David is not in complete hiding. Someone knows. He's heard this, right? But Saul is under just some great delusion that David is against him and that David is undermining him. And so he says, look, can my son or can this David give you great reward and promote you and give you status? But I can. So why are you not telling me where he is? Right? Start to get a little understanding of the motive here. And there was this one guy. Everyone was quiet. But there was this one guy. His name was Doeg. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. So Doeg goes on then to tattle about what Ahimelech had done to help David. And Doeg continues in verse 10, he inquired of the Lord for him and gave him victuals, food, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Well, I mean, if anyone had a right to that, it would have been David, right? So Saul then calls for Ahimelech to answer these accusations. And verses 11 through 13. Then the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests that were in Nob, and they came all of them to the king. And Saul said, hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, here I am, my lord. And Saul said unto him, why have ye conspired against me, thou and the son of Jesse, in that thou hast given him bread and a sword, and hast inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait, as at this day? So you can see that Saul is jumping to all kinds of conclusions here. That Ahimelech is actually not only supporting David, but has armed him so that he might rise up against Saul, and is supporting an insurrection, right? Here's Ahimelech's answer. I kind of like Ahimelech. He's got a little bit of sass. But he's still respectful. He says, then Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house, right? He insists, David is your most loyal subject. He only means to work for you. So here's where he gets, you read the tone into it, and he says, did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father. For thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. He says, look, David has been loyal to you. He has expressed loyalty to you. All I know about David is him supporting you. Did I only just now start praying for David? No, I pray for all your servants, right? especially those who are so loyal to you as David is. I don't know anything about this disloyalty that you suspect, that Saul had just iterated was his suspicion, right? So Ahimelech implies that he's always prayed for David, and the king demands his footmen then execute the priest. And the king said, "Thou shalt surely die, Ahimelech, thou and all thy father's house." And the king said unto the footmen that stood about him, "Turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, because they knew when he fled and did not show it unto me." But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. Well, the servants knew that Saul was beside himself, so to speak, right? And they also knew that, well, they knew better than to raise their hand against the priests of the Lord, right? So they refused to do it. But the depth of Doeg's cravenness here is revealed in his obedience to Saul and the extent to which he was willing to go. And the king said to Doeg, "Turn thou and fall upon the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priests, and he slew on that day 75 persons that did wear a linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and sucklings, oxen and ashes, and sheep with the edge of the sword. Now there's one escapee that finds David, and he tells him what's happened. And David, being the man that he is, he just feels absolutely horrible. He feels the weight of this great tragedy on himself, feeling that he has brought it on by coming to Ahimelech for food. Verse 20 says, "And one of the sons of Ahimelech, the sons of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar showed David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests. And David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, and with me thou shalt be in safeguard." So that's the occasion of this psalm. And it was driven, the writing of this psalm was driven by the evil folly of Doeg. David's so troubled by the damage that is caused by Doeg's folly that, I mean, he vividly frames his words and his actions, those of Doeg, as evil and deceitful. And you can see how David feels about this, especially at the beginning of this psalm. And from David's inspired descriptions of Doeg's folly, we can learn something of why people do the most wicked things that men do. And it tells us of the motives of the wicked. It tells us the consequences of the actions of the wicked and the words of the wicked. And it also tells us, though, the comfort that the righteous may take in a world that is filled with such things. And so we begin with the reality of the offender's motives in verses 1 through 4. I just have 3 points. The first one is for verses 1 through 4. It is, see the pride that motivates the offender, right? See the pride that motivated Doeg, that motivated the offender here. And we see that in verses 1 through 4. Why boasteth thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Thy tongue deviseth mischiefs like a sharp razor working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Selah. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. So to a person who's not in the place from which one can say or do the things that Doeg did. And by that I mean, I imagine you'd have a hard time, I suspect you'd have a hard time imagining being Doeg, right? Being the guy that would say, I saw him, king, when everyone else is obviously saying, yeah, we're not getting involved in this. But Doeg is the guy that steps up, right? And King Saul promises promotion. Doeg says, yeah, I saw him. and then Doeg does what he does. I mean, he wields the sword when no one else would. You say, I couldn't get there. Well, I think it's important to understand when you see someone who does such a terrible thing as Doeg did, right? Not only to turn against David, to frame his report to Saul in the way he did, but then to wield the sword against Doeg's family, to kill 85 priests and an entire village of the family of the priests. I mean, you say, I could never get there. But I think it's important when you see something that horrific to try to trace a person's steps from where they began. I guarantee you, to the most, I was going to say hoity-toity, but that just sounds, to the most righteous person in the room. Can I get a show of hands of who think they are? No, okay. Because then I was going to call you hoity-toity. I guarantee you've been on that path at the very beginning. And that's really the thing that we need to notice. Sometimes we see these horrific things and we say, I could never get there. But you might find yourself in the path that got Doeg to that place. And this is one of the great benefits of this psalm, is that we see David tracks the motive path for Doeg to this place. And so he tells us the motives of the wicked, the consequences of his actions, and the comfort that the righteous may take in a world filled with such things. So we begin then with the reality of the offender's motives, and it's the pride that motivates the offender. David frames Doeg as proud himself. And pride, always remember this, pride is the path to the unthinkable, right? Because pride is blinding. It makes you believe things that aren't true, to the extent that you can be so twisted as to then end up somewhere you say you could never get, right? And so Doeg seems the kind of man who thought himself aggrieved by life, wronged by everyone, right? He would have, and you can tell, I mean, no one else stepped forward, right? But there was one man in that crowd that thought, you know what? I owe this to myself, right? And he stepped forward. He would have thought he would have thought that he earned more respect, that he was due more respect, that he deserved more credit in life, that he had rights to more power and to more than he had. Otherwise, he likely would. He likely could not have justified ratting out David, who everyone knew was loyal to the king, right? Everyone but Saul had escaped that delusion. And so he's thinking, what do I owe David anyway? He can't do anything to help me. And this was a path to recognition by the king, to promotion and to favor, as the king had just promised, and we just read through that story. Doeg's thinking, I deserve this. He'd been looking for the opportunity to advance himself, and so this was that opportunity. This was his opportunity to advance himself. Yeah, it's a little bit ugly, but you know what? Who's earned this more than me, right? Who deserves this more than I do? He'd convinced himself that he was just doing the smartest thing. That he was the shrewd one. He was doing the thing that would result in getting what he deserved. But as sure as pride seems to be the shortest path to success, it is in reality just the shortest path. And I have to admit, sometimes I write something down and I think, oh, that is wisdom, so I'm going to read it twice. And unfortunately, it's about pride, so I don't know how to justify those two statements. Here it is. As sure as pride seems to be the shortest path to success, It is in reality just the shortest path. And that brings me to the first subpoint there under verses 1 through 4. And from verse 1, we see it is short-lived in comparison to the goodness of God. Why boastest thyself in the mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. You see how David is juxtapositioning Doeg's pride that led him to this place to God's goodness, which is continual. When we're thinking about how our cleverness might advance ourselves and justifying it by how much we deserve, whatever it is we think we're going to get, be sure to measure your pride against the goodness of God. And while we justify ourselves and we think, oh, I deserve this, so it's okay for me to go about it in this clever way and get what I deserve, we're extending what we think is going to happen by the action that we know is wrong. And we think, yeah, that is something that's going to last. That's going to bring me flourishing or whatever. This is going to put me in a position where I finally get what I deserve. What we're underestimating is the contrasting path of the goodness of God. We think, I can do gooder for myself than God can do, right? And the goodness of God is, I can do better for myself, but I was trying to stay with good. The goodness of God is, it endureth continually. When that path of pride ends in destruction, which it always will, and it's always shorter than you think it's going to be, the goodness of God would have kept going. So you may boast in your mischief and think yourself a mighty man to have attained so much by such means. But such things can only exist for the short term. And they can only exist for the short term because God's goodness never ends. I mean, just think about that logic, right? So long as God is good, the proud will be brought low. Right? God's actually said, I'm actively resisting the proud. So how long do you think that path will actually go if God's resisting you actively? Right? The proud will be brought low. And so long as God is good, the mischief of the proud will be revealed as a short-term or as a long-term failure. And as we further characterize how such atrocity as Doeg's could happen, we see that it starts by the contemplation of words that will bring others down. You can see this in verse 2. The very first phrase of verse 2, thy tongue deviseth mischiefs. He contemplates, this is how I've just paraphrased that, he contemplates mischievous things to say. He contemplates mischievous things to say. The tongue deviseth mischiefs. Now, of course, the tongue doesn't actually do the thinking, right? It doesn't actually do the devising. It's just a poetic form. The poetic form seems to indicate that. But what he's saying is, you're only thinking about what you can accomplish with your tongue, right? So the tongue is devising mischiefs. And such thinking and evil intention boils up from the heart that is diseased by pride to the point of thinking itself worthy of the honor of someone else, right? He sees the honor that other people get and he thinks, why don't I have that? I ought to have that. I think I can figure out how with my clever tongue. I think I know a shortcut to get the honor that someone else has. And so what does he do? The tongue deviseth mischiefs. Next, he says, like a sharp razor working deceitfully. So my second point there in verse 2 is that he cuts with his words. A tongue isn't a sharp instrument. Can I see? Let me see all your tongues. I didn't get a single tongue. Thank you. Thank you for that. There's a reward afterwards. So I'm just saying. No, you've all lost it. Don't. Your tongue is not a particularly sharp instrument, but it says here that it's like a sharp razor. Your tongue is not a sharp instrument, but nothing can cut so deeply or wound so effectively. Is that not true? I mean, what is it we used to say when we were kids? Thank you. I forgot what we used to say when we were kids. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And then as adults, you know, you've never been hurt by sticks and stones like you have by words. All right? Words will scar you for life. And he says that the tongue deviseth mischiefs like a sharp razor. Doeg wielded the knowledge that he held with such careless abandon because he felt like he was owed what would come to him, right? So his pride had blinded him to the reality of this. He might have defended himself even, right? By pointing out the truth of his report to Saul. Look, I just told Saul the truth, right? I just told him what it was. You can't blame me, right? And so, but it would take the blindness of pride to think it justified, as Doeg seemed to. So often people think to say what they know for some slight self-promotion, and that is justified. But words cut like a razor, and that wound may never heal. The third part of verse 2 is he's deceptive with his words. It says, thy tongue deviseth mischiefs like a sharp razor, working deceitfully. Now the final two words here in verse 2 speak of the deceit behind Doeg's report to Saul. But did he say anything that was inaccurate? Well, not really. But we kind of talked about that with the serpent talking to Eve in the garden too, right? He didn't say anything that was just absolutely blatantly inaccurate. I think it's important because people often defend their actions or words by the accuracy of what they say. And they think that they're in their prideful blindness that it couldn't be deceitful because, after all, it was accurate, right? But Doeg, he knew that David was loyal to Saul. He knew like everyone else knew. Doeg knew that David had no evil intent against Saul. Contrast Doeg's report to Saul with Ahimelech's report to Saul, right? Both said accurately what happened, but Doeg withheld the rightful defense of David. Remember, Ahimelech gave the context. He started with the context. He said, David is your most loyal servant. This guy he's only doing what is best for you and for your kingdom. Doeg, who are we talking about? David is not disloyal, and he frames that context before he reports. And withholding context is one of the most insidious ways to deceive. But Doeg's pride wouldn't let him admit that David was a better man than himself. And so he had to withhold the context. He was looking for glory. He was looking to advance himself. And Doeg had learned to enjoy the impact of his cutting words, thinking that they lifted him up to a place that he deserved to be. So he enjoyed how well they worked and how good he had got at wielding those words. And he didn't care that it hurt others. That brings us to verse 3. He enjoys saying hurtful things. Thou lovest evil more than good, David says, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. See, Doeg enjoyed the power of his evil report, and he loved that he could frame the narrative by leaving out the context of David's situation. Finally, we see the enjoyment of the destruction of his words. You see that in verse 4. He enjoys the destruction that his words cause. He says, thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. Doeg was such a small man on the inside that he loved how his words could devour and destroy. He just loved how powerful that made him feel. And it made him feel better about himself, having wielded them so cleverly, these words, and having wounded others so deeply. And that's the path of the proud in their offense. Verse 5, see the price that follows the offender. This one verse reminds that even though, and this is our second major point here, even though there may be temporary advantages achieved by the prideful offender, because God is good, a price will be exacted in the end. And it is a price that is much higher than ever contemplated by the proud. Verse 5, God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place and root thee out of the land of the living. Well, we can take those one at a time. We see, number one, if he's not saved, this offender will suffer eternally. You see that in the first clause, right? God shall likewise destroy thee forever, David says. As is often the case in Scripture, this verse draws the assumption that he who acts like they don't believe in God are not under God's protection, right? But I've framed this point by saying that this everlasting destruction is for those who are not saved, right? Because if someone believes in God and believes they will stand before him someday and answer for what they've done in this body, whether it be good or bad, right? And if someone has trusted in Jesus Christ as their Savior, it naturally follows that they would not do this kind of thing. Now, has anyone here ever met a Christian that you believe to be a Christian that doesn't act like one sometimes? Maybe. Do we have any here who has actually not acted like a Christian? All right. Well, this is like about 4 of us at least. And no, I mean, so will we be destroyed eternally for our actions? No, but trust me, that there is a price coming, and it'll probably be soon, right? So anyway, I've qualified the statements from my summary of verse 5 with if he's not saved, he will suffer eternally, right? So I mean to describe those who've not taken Jesus as their Savior. It's assumed by this verse that such a person would not be so motivated by pride as to hurt others with their tongue. And think about that for a minute. We could learn something from this and strive to live up to those expectations, right? You say, I'm a child of God. It shouldn't raise a whole lot of eyebrows around you when you say that. Everyone should be like, oh, well, that makes sense. You kind of act like one, right? That's what we draw from this. But we may at least understand that those who've not been saved, whose sins are not covered by faith in Jesus Christ, they will suffer eternally for this sin and for others. The second clause we see in verse 5 is, he shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place. So it's kind of not just an eternal punishment here. But if he does not stop, he's going to lose what he has. And having established the qualifier, if, I've just written these 3 points each with one qualifier. If he does not stop, he will lose what he has. In this case, we may assume that this is a person who continues in their sin, that God and God will take away from him what he has gained. So that path of sin, you're going to lose it all anyway, right? He's going to take that back. Sometimes he takes it back just by making sure you don't enjoy it as much as you thought you would, right? And then what you got is like a great burden. That which is won by pride and deceit is not lasting in this world. And the reason for this is that it shows a lack of respect for that which God blesses. And so much so as to draw his judgment instead. The last thing we see here in verse 5 is, and root thee out of the land of the living. That's a pretty poetic way to say, what do they say? What do the kids say nowadays? Make you unalived, right? God shall destroy thee forever. He shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place and root thee out of the land of the living. This being rooted out of the land of the living that's a vividly poetic way of saying such a person sets themselves up to be taken from this life, to lose even the privilege of breathing the air that God created for his glory, right? Turns out he's in charge of that air. And when he says, this air is no longer for you, he gets to say that, right? But the righteous takes comfort, not in the destruction of the wicked so much as the lessons that the consequences to the wicked teach him. And this brings us to verses 6 through 9. And so what we see here in this third point is, see the prize that comforts the righteous. See the prize that comforts the righteous. The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusteth in the abundance of his riches, and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise thee forever because thou hast done it. I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. Okay, verse 6. What we see here in verse 6, the righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, is the fear of God dispels the fear of man, right? Think about this for just a second, because Doeg has just slain 85 priests and an entire village of the priests' families. Would you say that might instill fear in people's hearts? Yes, absolutely. So when David is saying they will laugh at him, what he's saying is, we will not let this act of terror change our heart towards God, because we fear him, not man, right? It isn't a necessary conclusion that we should laugh at people who fall. That's not the point here. As a matter of fact, we're not to rejoice when our enemy falls. The Bible actually gives us that command. But we may find some joy in the contrast of a life that fears God and a life that fears man. And if you find yourself in a life that fears God instead of fearing man, well, it's a pretty happy place to be. Because you have two choices in life. You will fear, right? You can pretend like you don't fear. You can even say no fear on your hat or whatever. They don't even have that slogan anymore. That was an old one, huh? But everyone fears, right? You can choose to fear God or pretty much everything else, right? If you fear God, you don't need to fear anything else because he's got your back. If you fear everything else, well, you do that because you don't fear God. So we rejoice not when our enemy falls, but in the contrast of a life that fears God and a life that fears man, because that's the plight of the proud. If we live in fear of God, and beloved, no fear was ever so rightfully earned as this, right? We need not fear man at all. But if we fear man, we will eventually suffer the judgment of God. So that brings us to verse 7. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusteth in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. So this is the lesson. The lesson of the wicked is instructive. The lessons of the wicked are instructive. I corrected that in yours and not mine. But we may look upon the life of one who's been destroyed by his lack of faith in God and his lack of obedience to God's commands, and we might learn from that. This was a man who trusted in his own strength and didn't trust in God's strength. This was a man that trusted in riches rather than in God's blessing. This was a man that sought only to strengthen himself, and he did that by wickedness. And this is instructive to the righteous. Verse 8, purity of heart is beautiful and lasting. This is such a beautiful simile here, and I hate that I have taken up all my time and can't park on this one. I'm like a green olive tree in the house of God. There's so much in that metaphor right there. But we'll have to move on past it. There's your homework right there. Just find out all the things that are in that simile. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. In contrast to the instruction of the wicked man's life, we may see that the life of a righteous person, it flourishes in the house of God. And this flourishing in this life, it's just the beginning. It lasts forever. It says, I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. To trust in the mercy of God is exactly the opposite of living in pride and a sense of entitlement, right? That is a short path. The mercy of God is an enduring path. The beauty of the olive tree in the house of God is the simile that we have here to describe the purity of heart. Okay, finally, verse 9, the work of the Lord in our life is praiseworthy. He says, now David has come to the place that David always comes, right? I will praise thee forever because thou hast done it. I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. There's still no pride when the enemy is defeated. There's only praise for the one who is praiseworthy. And then second part of verse 9 is that the name of the Lord is trustworthy. He says, I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. To wait on his name means to trust him. When you wait on the Lord, what it means is that you're waiting for him to do what he's going to do, and you don't jump forward to do your own thing because you trust him. And so he's trustworthy like no other. So when we see the wicked use their tongue to lash out at those around them, it's tempting to follow suit. But let's reach for a higher option and find our peace in our relationship with God, not in the destructiveness of our tongue. So that is Psalm 52, Doeg's Folly.